Afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think everyone's a little wet this afternoon from the rainstorm in the middle of January, but we are going to start briefly and then take a break. The staff's drafted language for the topics we covered yesterday was distributed pretty late this afternoon, so we want to give everyone time to read that before we go into the specifics of that. I do want to say I think we have slips. Speaker slips in the front of the room if anyone needs to turn those in. I think at this point we don't have any speakers that we're aware of. And I believe there were no additional public comments received since yesterday's meeting, so we'll move past that as well. The minutes from last week's meeting have been distributed, not yesterday's minutes yet, but last week's meeting. So any questions or concerns about those? Can I have a motion for approval? A second? All those in favor? Aye. Anyone opposed? Okay, then we'll move forward with the minutes then. So as I said, we have, the members of the committee have received staff's drafted language on council size, structure, and area commissions, and we'll start with that after our break. I'm going to assume everyone's had a chance to read that since we've had it for a number of days. What was sent out earlier today was the draft language on vacancies and appointments and employment status. So I want to take a break, give everyone a chance to read that, ask for any clarifying points from staff, or be prepared when we come back. And I think staff also noted, as I went through this and had some conversations last night, some staff comments about things we probably want to consider as they tried to craft language from all of our different ideas. So I think there's some highlighted areas that we can probably talk through more when we come back. I just wanted to point that out. So I have 2:52, so we'll come back about 5 after 3, if everyone wants to take a few minutes to read. Okay, so we're going to take a break, and we will be back at about 5 after 3. Thank you. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I think everyone's had a chance to read those items. First thing I want to start with, there were a couple of, research requests or questions that came from yesterday's meeting. I think staff was prepared to answer some of those. Edward, did you have? Adam?
Yes.
Okay. Are you prepared to answer those?
Yes, sir. Members of the committee, yesterday there was a request for information on salary or part-time, full-time status of a county prosecutor. I believe Mr. Rosenberger brought up the question. Doing some initial research looking into Ohio Revised Code, section 325.11, subsection C. The statute does read that a county prosecuting attorney shall not engage in the private practice of law unless before taking office, the attorney notifies the Board of County Commissioners of his intention to engage in private practice. It goes on to state that that attorney may elect to engage or not engage in that private practice before the commencement of each new term. And should he decide to engage, but then in a subsequent term not engage in the practice of law, he still has an obligation and duty to inform county commissioners. Should he decide to, on the front end, abandon his practice before entering office, or wrap up his, or not engage in the second and subsequent term, he then is afforded a 6-month term or 6-month period in which to wrap up his affairs, close up the business, move clients here, and so forth. That's in the statute itself. The statute does indicate a matrix for relevant purposes here. For the calendar year of 2017, for a county prosecutor with a private practice in a county of 1,001 persons or more, that person would be paid a salary of $95,276. Should the county prosecutor in 2017 not have a private practice in a county of 1,001 or more, that person would be paid $133,759. And it does have subsequent salaries for 2018, 2019 as well. And then in 2020, there is a provision that indicates that in that year, the county prosecutor will make the equivalent of the highest paid county judge in common pleas, minus $100. So he would make $100 less. That county prosecutor would make $100 less than the highest paid common pleas judge in 2020. Thank you.
Any questions about that information? I don't recall any additional research requests from yesterday.
There was one. I can't tell you what it was.
Chair Co, members of the committee, there was a request that we provide information about the Citizens Commission on
right.
elected official compensation. I'll begin with a few just sort of general themes about limitations on increase and decrease of council salary, an overview of why the 2014 commission added this to the charter for the first time, and then Tracy has the specific language that she can talk through as well. So first of all, the standard limitations for a council member apply just as it would any other elected official in Ohio. They cannot vote to change their pay midterm, so they can't take any action to change their pay in midterm either. So anything that would affect their pay has to take place prior to their being sworn into that office. That's a standard thing in City of Columbus. There's also, both in the City of Columbus and, at least to my knowledge, all other legislative bodies in Ohio, a presumption that there would be uniform pay for like service. So that there would be a standard baseline pay that all people would receive, and it would be additional service that would provide additional income. For example, as folks know, at the State House, serving as a chair of a committee, minority leader, majority leader, that sort of thing. The same thing applies here in the City of Columbus, where all council members are paid the same amount except for the council president, who receives an additional amount for serving in that role. As to the Citizens Commission on elected official compensation, as we looked at newer city charters in the state of Ohio and in other cities across the country, almost without exception, they included a process where salaries were set by someone other than the legislative body itself. The best practice that we saw was a process where citizens would weigh it, where they were limited exclusively to fact-based determinations. So they had to look at objective criteria, they had to look at peer cities, and it had to be a like public official. So mayor to mayor, city attorney to city attorney. What we also found was that it was a best practice that the council still had to act on it. So it was not that this recommendation was automatic, but the council could never exceed the recommendation. So they could say, well, you've recommended, let's say, $1 million a year, which would never happen. We don't think that's appropriate, so instead we're going to go with $80,000 a year. And then lastly, to control intra-term increases, it also put a limitation that is linked back to the average of the cost of living increase for the previous 4 years. So again, putting something in there that is fact-based and objective.
So in keeping with members of the committee and Chair Co, in keeping with the idea that it was set up to be an independent body based on data analysis, the Citizens Commission on Elected Official Compensation was approved in November of 2014 to review and recommend the salary for each elective officer, with the underlying goal of increasing citizen engagement and adding an additional layer of accountability to the process of setting future pay rates for elected officials in Columbus, and it serves on a 4-year cycle. The commission's charge by charter entails offering salary recommendations that include an annual cost of living adjustment not to exceed the average increase in the consumer price index of the prior 4 years, and the salary or compensation, like Brian was saying, must be uniform for like service. This is all part of this Columbus City Charter under Section 15, and that will be, you'll see that in the document that is being handed out right now by Stephanie. So the commission must conduct a review of salaries for like positions in the public sector. This is made for purpose of recommending salaries that are appropriate to the duties and responsibilities of each elective officer. The commission, however, must be noted, did not evaluate the specific duties and responsibilities of council members. The charter requires that once the report is submitted, then council shall by ordinance either accept the commission recommendations or parts of it thereof, or they have to reject it. And if they reject the recommendations, then the salary then in effect remains unchanged. In no event may council adopt an ordinance establishing salaries that exceed the recommendations of the commission. And that's just a general overview from Section 15 of the charter.
Sometimes I like to try to simplify things. So what I heard in all that was that the commission, I think they're called, commission has to use factual evidence to determine a compensation change. So I think we're kind of out of order a little bit, but so when we discuss kind of the conversation we had yesterday about giving them language or recommending language that they can consider the fact that I think the expectation is that most council members are full-time or doing more than part-time. Without something factual, that's going to be hard for them to make an adjustment based upon, I don't know, I guess based upon our statements. Is that I'm trying to...
More on quantitative analysis
Yeah.
rather than qualitative.
Okay, Carrie, go ahead.
What would be an example of that? What kind of,
Review of city, like the Consumer Price Index, looking at peer cities for other like positions, other public positions and salaries, rather than looking at certain kind of subjective description of duties or responsibilities.
Is it as simple as like if our charter said these positions are full-time and said nothing else, like didn't restrict what full-time means, then they would look at similar positions that are identified as full-time?
Yes, because there are charters that indicate in different cities that these will be full-time members.
So ours doesn't say that. So we have a silent.
Ours is silent.
So they're limited by finding that comparable position to other charters that are limited or other, I'm just trying to figure out how this practically plays out. Brian?
So the specific verbiage of the charter would not limit it to the wording of a similar peer cities charter. They could certainly look at the policies of a peer cities council. So if, for example, council were to adopt a policy that said council members shall be considered full-time except for, now that would be problematic, but were they to do it, the committee could look at that. What the committee would likely be, probably would not be appropriate for them to do, would be to look at subjective comments from any outside body. Whether it was from council, from the mayor's office, from a nonprofit. The idea was to insulate them from that sort of subjective consideration and really say, you know, what do the facts tell us about this pay?
So I think similar to some of the language that you all put together for us to review, we wouldn't necessarily have to recommend any change to the charter, but council could take action that would give them specific quantitative, is that the right word? Information to consider the next time the commission meets versus just opinions from us or any other body.
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. Does that make sense? No. Okay.
And I'm not being smart. I'm just, so what you were saying is that council could take these suggestions, these qualitative items, and act on those? That's where you lost me, between what the compensation commission and the other, the question, I'm sorry, may I?
Yes, please.
Okay. The question that I have is, if the charter is silent, it does not say part-time, it does not say full-time, and you're saying that they can only compare a city that's part-time or full-time or undefined. That's what I'm reading here. With peers that had part-time or undefined. But my argument is, our charter doesn't say part-time. So why would that be a limitation? And the other comment I would like to make, the commission covers other elected officials within City Hall. And from what you said, only the mayor's language specifically limits outside employment. So would the commissions be obligated under this rationale that they could only look at city attorneys just by peer and just the quantitative data? Because it's, and my point is, they're not classified as full-time. So I'm just at loss at how this, the council term has become such an issue now. And I probably was just as confusing, I just probably
No.
confused you, but. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, I'm trying to think this through, because there's some gaps to me of why is this becoming,
So, just speaking purely about the considerations of the first commission that looked at this pay, part of what they look at is the responsibilities and duties of the office, and look at like offices. For a city attorney, for example, most cities don't have a voted city attorney, so they would be looking at appointed law directors as the sort of apples to apples there. And I think there is an unspoken presumption that probably influenced their discussions, and I think the minutes of that committee bear it out, that the mayor, the city attorney, and the auditor are expected to be full-time by virtue of the fact that none of them have outside employment and haven't, other than, I think, Mr. Dorian teaching at OSU, I think that would be about the extent of it. Whereas for council, right, which is still outside employment, I think as you know well, the history of our council has been that the majority of council members have some form of employment in addition to, and I think that the historic salaries of council members have also led one to assume that it's not a full-time position. And I believe that was the rational basis that they used, whereas a council policy, presuming that this is a first obligation or a primary purpose, or however you put it, would sort of change that calculus, I think, in their minds as they move forward.
I guess the concern that I have, I thought the commission, by establishing this body to look objectively, would eliminate some of that, because, I guess I thought the commission would eliminate some of the issues that we're talking about now for the very reasons, it's subjective and it's peer review, et cetera, et cetera.
I think, Chair Coe and members of the committee, a council policy elevates it, at least in my mind, beyond the subjective and gives a concrete expectation versus sort of the unspoken assumptions that may sometimes bias the way that we look at things like this. I think was the extent of staff's intent in making that comment.
And I think too, I'm not arguing that council members aren't fully committed, obviously. But I guess it seems like we got off track a little bit. To me, we got off track a little bit from what we were asked to do yesterday. And just to make the classifications, just to say council is a full-time position, it goes beyond that. That's my concern. By just declaring this is a full-time position, we can go to HR. That opens up a lot of other things and issues that we haven't discussed. So I'm reluctant to make that off the cuff declaration, because I know that there are other things that come to that goes along with that. Madam Chair, I'm just
agree.
rambling thoughts
No.
here, but I'm concerned about.
And as I thought about all this last night and this morning, I think to some degree we have to balance being too specific with, there are elected members of council who ultimately are the ones held accountable for a lot of the things we're talking about. So I think a little bit when we talked about like what a public hearing would look like, I don't think it's really our task to go that specific, but I think we leave this at a little bit higher level. I think Carrie has made the comment like we need some specifics, and I don't disagree. I think some of the things we talked about area commissions, I think it's important for us to be a little specific, but I think the idea is that council needs to, they're the ones who are elected and and paid and held accountable for making these specific decisions. So I think we have to be careful, maybe to that point, to get into too much of the day-to-day workings or being too restrictive in this scenario and more giving guidance. And I think as I was listening to the explanation about the compensation commission, I think we want to make sure we're sticking with the evidence of what we saw, so that, I mean, I think that was part of our, sorry, what do I want to use, mission, or, you know, our scope from the beginning was to look at the facts. So I think as we go through this, you know, we can disagree as to what's a fact. I think that's a fair challenge, but I do think we want to make sure as we look through each of these topics today, like, does the information that we heard, ask, and understand support what we're ultimately recommending or not recommending? So I think we're going to leave this discussion for a minute because I kind of want to go in order with the size and structure discussion first. And this is basically my plan for today, is that we walk through all of the language and hopefully give staff some more clear direction on things we want edited or added or modified. I don't intend to vote on a final language today. I think we need to get time to go through all these and probably see some revisions. So our next meeting will be a week from tomorrow on the 20th. Based upon how today goes, we may have final versions to look at that meeting and vote, or we may need to consider a meeting after that. We'll kind of know better at the end of this meeting. So that's my plan. So I'm not asking, I don't think I'm going to ask that we vote on any of these specific things today, but that we give staff some analysis of, you know, we want to see this changed or modified or updated. So we're going to start with the size and structure piece. So again, I believe everyone's had plenty of time to read that. It was available a few days ago. So just want to start with comments, concerns. Where, you know, I don't want to spend a long time going line by line if people are generally speaking okay with it. I've heard a little bit of feedback, I think, but anybody? John? I like to volunteer.
Why do people always pick on me?
The microphone's pointed at you.
Well,
so.
thank you. I said to Edward, he really is a wonderful writer. I really have a lot of compliment for him about that. All right, so I read this. I thought, something doesn't feel quite right here, but I was really wrestling with what it was. And one of the risks of being the person who composes the things that were given to us for background information is the sense it's already in a Word document. Hey, this is really easy to move into their final report. And so we did. And so then when I read it, it sort of feels like the fact that this has been repeatedly asked and answered somehow is really material to what we're about to conclude here. I don't think that's the case at all. You know, every election is a snapshot where the voters have made their judgment based on the then facts and circumstances. So in this history of what's happened heretofore, frankly, there's only one that counts. It's August 2nd of 2016. And what happened on that occasion was the electorate said, based upon current facts and circumstances, we know from Brian that sometimes involves economics, it involves your personal well-being, it involves the flaws, perceived or otherwise, in what's proposed in the alternative. People made a judgment 7 months ago. That's the only piece of history that's material here. And we've got 3 lawyers up here. I've never practiced domestic relations, but you get your child support set. You think you want to change, you go in, the judge says, what's the change in circumstances? And if you don't have a good answer, there's nothing to talk about. My question for us is, what is the change in circumstances that gives us standing to speak on this point and makes our opinion even relevant? I think the question is whether or not it's the right time to make a recommendation. And you've heard me go on at length about this before. I think it's much more important that we show respect for the validity of the things that got fleshed out in the election, try to respond in the near term with fixes, and tide this over until one of 2 things happen. One is time for the Charter Review Commission, the real ones, to entertain the question again, or in the alternative, when people collectively decide that based upon the facts and circumstances, at large doesn't work anymore, and by God, they want the question reviewed. So my suggestion is we back out all this history. The only history that's material is what happened on August 2nd, and it happened persuasively, And frankly, I think we rightfully can reach a conclusion. There have been no change in circumstances that make our opinion at this moment in time relevant. Back to this giving, respecting what the election fleshed out as the weaknesses of at-large and try to respond in a different way in the meantime. There I am.
Okay. I understand. Carrie.
I would just follow up a little bit on that in the sense that, what was really compelling to me throughout the course of this conversation was not necessarily the outcome of the election, but what was compelling to me was the lack of competitiveness in ward elections. Because, and I've said this before, but, the health and vibrancy of a democracy is predicated on competitive elections. And when you see the lack of competitiveness in other ward elections, that tells me that probably, is one indicator that representative governance isn't as strong as it could be. And so I guess just for the, I guess I would articulate the sort of intro to this a little bit different. The charge of this council, or this commission, in my view, this committee, in my view, was to not just kind of react to the election, but it was to help think through how the city managed its growth and its governance structure. And so that was the lens through which I looked at it. And I came into this with very much an open mind, despite the fact that the ward proposal on the ballot last year was overwhelmingly rejected. That is a consideration. It is a factor. I just wouldn't put it as the prime factor. And so I don't mean to be overly critical on sort of the circumstances that frame our recommendations on this point. I just want to share with you my viewpoint, which is that was part of it, certainly, but what was really compelling to me was some of the data that we heard in testimony around competitive elections. And I think the very real concern we had from the public input that there is an opportunity to strengthen the governance structure within City Hall to make sure all those voices are heard. And I think, what we're driving towards is a way that both accommodates the growth of the city and tries to hopefully strengthen the area commissions to be that voice that we heard. So I guess not to go on too long about this, I wouldn't put too much weight necessarily in the election results. My view is that I was particularly informed by some of the data that was provided to us throughout the committee process, as well as some of the input that we heard from citizens. So I don't know if I characterize, the intro the same exact way, but I appreciate the work that was put into it.
Other thoughts? Okay, Jeanette.
It moved you to the wrong side of the table.
Yeah. My peeps are over there. Couple of things. I agree with both comments, but I'm thinking we're here because there was an election. Why did people feel compelled to go out and vote? Why was that issue on the ballot? And it goes back to people felt that they were not being represented under the current structure. So with that in mind, it's important, the vote was important, but the follow-through. We know that the vote said that the citizens did not want a ward and district structure, but we were charged with looking at the structure of council, and when we were talking about this, we were discussing how could we and what could we do to improve constituent services and responsiveness. With all the great things that are occurring in this city, and we looked at that, our peer cities, our ratings, all of the great things that are occurring, we did acknowledge that there was a disconnect. And it's surprising to me, specifically with city council, I looked at the first monthly newsletters, that's what it's called, the first council newsletter that came out. Yes, okay. The efforts that's being made to connect, it's not neglect. There are legitimate efforts being made to work with and connect with the public, and yet a large segment of this city felt compelled to vote to change the structure. So in my view, looking at what we can do, knowing the vote, but what we can do. And one of the changes that I mentioned, and I would still like added here, is that I would like city council to conduct its own self-assessment and evaluation. Because there's a representation role of council, and there's the constituent service role. And we focused on the area commissions and that external. And my concern is what happens internally when someone actually connects because of the comments that have been made. We've had some here, some others, and I think it would be beneficial to see if there can be some improvements internally, simultaneously while trying to connect externally. Because we have so many good touch points, and the 311, I mean, that is such a rapid response. We have our community engagement. I'm just saying somewhere, let's see what we can tweak so that people can fully engage and use the services that we're providing and close this gap, because I'm perplexed by it somewhat.
Other thoughts? I think my interpretation in reading it was, and I haven't heard anyone say yet, that the specific maybe sentence or two that's the recommendation, I don't think I had a lot of issues with. It was sort of the fill around it that I wondered about, and I think staff has done a phenomenal job. Many of you have said that, and I want to echo that. But I think to try to address sort of all points of this, I'm not sure anyone's really disagreeing. I think it's more of the language. So I guess I was just trying to take notes as everyone was talking. I feel like there's some desire to have less history, sort of spelled out. I mean, the history is the history, it is the fact, but maybe less spelled out. And I think we get to the area commission piece and recommendations, but I think maybe if we were more detailed about kind of the responsiveness idea, and I think Jeanette just hit that pretty clearly, that it's not just responsiveness externally, that I don't think we really talked about that idea of self-assessment. Again, I don't think that's a charter recommendation, but a recommendation maybe to council, because I do think we clearly heard a disconnect. I mean, I think many of us know that there are lots of great things going on, and lots of citizens feel like they're connected, but there's still a group of people, obviously some came before us, that don't feel connected. So I think that is probably a really valid point. And maybe we need to note a little bit more of the data. I think I kind of opened with that a little bit, that I think our task was to look at specific facts and not just our feelings or opinions. So maybe instead of as much history, we want a little more facts, and I don't mean pages of facts, but a couple bullet points as to why we made the recommendations that we did. So how does everyone feel? I mean, I guess Carrie and John in particular, I mean, do you disagree with each other, or can we put both of your ideas into the same?
Largely, we're in violent agreement.
I think so, yeah.
Now we're into the words.
Yeah.
The words recommends retaining current form of at-large, and then we shut up. That bothers me. At best, we're saying recommend retaining the current form of at this time, because we're still in the window of the people having spoken on the question. And one of my problems here is it is a single sentence that stands alone. In fact, it should press ahead and acknowledge the bona fide issues raised in the process. We should be dedicating ourselves to responding in the near term on a non-charter amendment basis. And I'm still on this thing that we should leave behind infrastructure to guide the creation of the alternative the next time it's presented, because the question's entitled to be presented, that being district representation, and it should be presented in the best possible form. Now, part of the problem here is because facts and circumstances change, what might be the best possible form today may not be the best possible form 3 years from now, 6 years from now, choose your period of time. So I'm all for at this time, and more sentences that put some more meat on our finding here.
And the finding being this idea of responsiveness, or the lack of?
Well, the specific finding is it recommends retaining at this time. That's We need crystalline declaration about that. And then we press ahead and talk about the validity of some of the issues fleshed out, the need to respond in the near term on a non-charter revision basis. And then finally, again, leaving behind infrastructure. So that if this question gets presented, again, it gets presented in the best possible, with the best possible thinking.
I follow that. So thoughts, Carrie? Can you mesh what John said with what you think?
Well, I'd like to just hear a little bit more from staff on the area commission recommendations, because these all look right, and I'm very supportive of what's been drafted here. I'd like to have a little bit more perspective, perhaps, from staff, but I think my colleague down there had a question maybe before we jump into that.
Yes, it was the language. Where is, under council organization and outreach, and it says potential solutions may include. And I was wondering, are those our actual recommendations and not potential solutions? That's what I was just wondering why that was written a little differently.
So maybe if staff wants to address maybe those thoughts and, to Carrie's point, a little more detail?
I'm just asking, did we mean
Yeah.
for these items, because these were things we specifically
Yeah.
discussed. did
I'm just
we-
wondering if staff separated them for a specific reason. I'm gonna go with silence means no, but
Well, but see, it says potential
Yeah.
solutions may include, not we recommend, or, I don't know, maybe it's just how it's placed. That was confusing to me.
yeah.
If we were recommending each one of these 4 items.
I think that was listed as things that we heard from the committee, but we're looking for a little more guidance in terms of how you wanted it written out and where you wanted it listed, and so we put that on there for clarity to recall to mind for the committee, but we probably need a little more guidance on where it goes and if it goes in.
And that's my question. I was wondering, did we make those definitive recommendations, or, I know we talked about it, but I didn't know what we'd agreed either.
So let's just go back to the beginning of that section.
This was our best effort.
Yeah.
It was very
Of
good.
reading our minds, exactly. All right, so the specific, I'm starting with supporting area commissions. The Charter Review Committee recommends further study by City Council and the Mayor to strengthen the operation and efficiency of area commissions. The committee specifically recommends a process similar to the current Charter Review Committee. And then we have specific recommendations, so providing area commission coverage for every city resident. Anyone have a concern about that? I'm gonna kind of walk through these, okay. No, go ahead, Carrie.
So does that mean that, we learned that there were some some parts of the city that weren't covered by area commissions? So do you envision by this recommendation, working to stand up and establish area commissions in those cities, those pockets of the community that don't have representation?
And also to follow up on that question, or to add to that question, what if you're a civic association? So what if you have a civic association that is very active and it's not an area commission? Does it then need to turn into an area commission, or would we allow them to remain a civic association? Maybe that does not. maybe that
My
hasn't
2 cents
been
was again, I want to balance this getting into too much nitty-gritty detail, so I think there will have to be some significant evaluation done to what do you do about things like the Northwest Civic, Northland Community Council, where they have strong organizations already and may not be supportive of an area commission, but council could do all kinds of
But
things
there's
to.
no mention of that. I'm so sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. There's no mention of a civic association in there, so if you read this, then, and you are that.
Yeah, I guess my thought is that the city doesn't control civic associations. So if you write civic association here, which of the 280 some are we talking about? So I think we know we're talking about kind of the 1 or 2 that are very large. My thought process was to leave it more vague so that every citizen will be covered by an area commission and allow this future committee or council to sort out what that means. And it may be some formal recognition of Northland Community Council or the Northwest Civic, that instead of calling it an area commission. I mean, I think they could flesh that out. I just worry that we're getting too into the nitty-gritty detail, and yet the idea is every citizen should have a body that's area commission equivalent to be addressed. That's kind of my thought.
And I think the way that we tried to capture it was these were things that you thought would be helpful for a, I guess, commission on area commissions to look at. but not something for this body necessarily to say, this is your goal, make sure this happens, and, you know, how are you going to do that? But this is work for another body.
Yeah.
May I connect the dots?
Yes.
You've heard my view. I think we are now talking about showing respect to issues flushed out in the vote. And this is one of the responses about something that can be done in the meantime, short of amending the charter. Just wanted to connect those dots in that way, because I do think we're going in the same direction on this.
So we have addressing administrative support needs for area commissions, including but not limited to staff support, funding, web hosting, records retention, organizational development, training, and community engagement. So again, we're not telling them how to address those, but just those are topics that were raised. Streamlining and equalizing the organization and operation of area commissions, including but not limited to uniform bylaws, elections, zoning processes, public notice, and participation. So I think we heard some discussions about making those more consistent. Ensuring adherence to city and state laws regarding open meetings and open records. I think that may just be a compliance thing and training. So then I think as Jeanette was pointing out, we go on to give what are possible potential solutions. So I think the question is, do we want to take any of items 1 through 5 and maybe make them a little more concrete as far as being a recommendation? So we have 1, associating council members with a specific geographic group of area commissions, provided council members remain accessible and accountable to all areas of the city. I'm going to read all 5 of these first. Establishment of a formal area commission president's advisory committee, recognizing that such a committee would advise all local government. Assessing the effectiveness and potential expansion of council's external affairs function. Educating Columbus residents about the role of council and the ways in which residents may interact with their legislative representatives, and hosting a conference of area commissions to bring together all area representatives to discuss best practices and provide training on universally applicable topics. So we want to start with number 1. I guess I will, because I would like to see a recommendation that's a little more like moving item 1 to a recommendation. I don't necessarily want to tell council how to connect council member to area commission, but I think that was a really great idea of making sure area commissions knew there was a primary contact. So I don't know that I would be as specific about saying, we did use the word geographic, but you know, I don't necessarily care if council decides that a member gets a certain section of the city and 3 area commissions, or if they decide it's 1 in 3 quadrants. I don't know that that matters as much as citizens feeling like, you know, council member X is our primary contact. Do we like that, or we don't like that idea at all?
I like the idea. I'm just concerned about leaving out civic associations. I mean, we have commissions, and that's great, but I would not like to be disrespectful to all the civic associations that are out there, to feel that they don't have access to council because.
Do you mean civic associations like
Northland?
Northwest and Northland,
Yeah.
or do you mean the 290 some others that make up the other area commissions?
Yeah.
I think in my thinking when I mentioned that was, I think that this is another example of, right? If I read this, again, thinking about process, and I want to go on and see what are the recommendations from this committee, if I was one of those civic associations, I do not see myself represented here. And so I think you have to dig a little bit beneath the surface to see what the intention is behind that. And I think that that's what we're referring to. That's why I think no mention or reference of does not feel right to me.
Okay, so I don't disagree. My only issue is that city council doesn't control civic associations. So if you build them into some of these processes, then you're forcing them to public meetings and all those open meeting requirements that they don't currently have. So I think what you're talking about is how they're represented.
How they're acknowledged, I think,
Yes.
is the word that I'm
that's
trying
what
to
I'm-
use.
yeah.
Because I understand the importance of the area
Yeah.
commissions, but I want to be cautious of how we write this, because we're not saying to council members that you should only be accessible and accountable to area commissions. We're saying all areas of the city, and that would include some of the areas that have the predominant commission, civic associations. I'm just trying to be inclusive and not seeming that we're solely focused on the city's designated organization and leaving everyone else. But I'm thinking it's the acknowledgement that I'm trying to
And I don't think we need to get into the nitty
Yeah,
gritty either.
but that
I
was my
do think
point.
it does need to
Yeah,
be
we're
acknowledged.
agreeing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know how.
Can we maybe come up with language that, I like the words acknowledging civic associations? Because
Better word for the day.
well, maybe, we'll take note. Because I think that we're both right. But how we write them into this, I just don't want to confine, and now we have 298 civic associations or whatever it was that have to do things in a very different way. So,
I
yeah.
just wanted,
But I think we want a
acknowledge-
mechanism to
yeah,
make sure
sure
that
that-
they're not unheard or unrepresented. So can we maybe figure out language to add references to, I should probably have to say like civic associations and like block watches, I think usually get, you wouldn't go? Okay.
That's what I would say, association, because those are organized
Yeah.
functions that the community members themselves have organized.
Madam Chair, I'm prepared to trust staff on this. We're talking about geography and then trying to come up with words that pick up the geography. I think enough said. May I have one other comment
On this point?
on both of these points,
Okay.
most recent? It's just wordsmithing, and I apologize. Recommend further study, recommend investigation. Let's recommend something.
Yeah.
I mean, this a study of a study. That doesn't work for me, and it's just too many words. I think we're recommending that we strengthen the operation efficiency of bang. We don't have to recommend further study. The study will be how they accomplish it. I don't like stacking these words on top of each other. It sounds like it's two dances in a row.
Okay, so I think what you're really saying is sort of the Charter Review Committee recommends strengthening the operation and efficiency of area commissions.
Right.
Obviously, that will require City Council and the mayor to further study how to do that.
Absolutely.
I think staff gets that. And then, so far, I think items 1 through 4, we want to keep as specific recommendations. And we want to add item 1 from the next page, the last page, to that, but some clear acknowledgement of civic associations somehow in that wording. Is everyone okay with that so far? Okay, so this idea of a president's advisory committee, do we think that's something that needs moved to a specific recommendation? Fred?
I don't have an opinion on where we align it, but recognizing that such a committee would advise all of local government, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Are we talking about townships, the city of Valley View? I don't know that we can recommend that to other local governments, so.
So to go back to the question that Chair Coe asked earlier in the meeting, why did staff list this as potential solutions? And why was the language couched the way that it was under area commissions? Area commissions interact with all branches of city government. The mayor's office, city attorney, city auditor, and city council. Of necessity, any change to those commissions is going to affect those branches as well. I think we were recognizing that since this was a committee that was convened to look at council only, we wanted to give some ability for the other branches of government to have an equal say in the potential outcomes of any studies. So that was the purpose of some of the couching language that you see there, and it is also the purpose of acknowledging that even a president's advisory committee would not just speak to council, it would also speak to the administration, city auditor, and city attorney.
But only of Columbus.
Only of Columbus, that is correct.
Because this leads me to think that we're talking about other local governments.
No, it would only be for the city of Columbus, that's correct.
We can wordsmith that.
Before I just read through 2 through 5, do we think 2 through 5 just belong on the same list as 1 through 4? Or is there something that you would delete or change? I mean, do we want to be as specific as saying hosting a conference of area commissions? Or do we want to just kind of leave that as an idea that gets fleshed out? Because it seemed to me 3 and 4 were logical, that we want to educate Columbus residents, and then we want to assess the effectiveness of the external affairs function. And I'm assuming that's a reference to community engagement? Yeah. So I guess I felt like 3 and 4 were things we seemed to feel strongly about. 2 and 5, do you want to be that specific, or do you want to just leave that for?
I think 2 is pretty specific. I think that's a specific directive
Yeah.
that could, that that addresses the issue, right? Of how do we bring these groups together, much like number 1 does, I think, right? I think, I mean, number 5 is a good idea, but to your point, I think it's an idea. 3 and 4, I would agree with you on as well. I think 1 and 2 are very specific in terms of these are things that you can establish and do that address the issues that were brought forth during the process.
So I just heard you, you'd keep 1 through 4 and move them to the other page and just leave 5 as a great idea, but not something we're going to specifically recommend.
Yes, I think so. Hold on.
Madam Chair, we can finesse our way out of this. Take the points you've indicated are strong, and simply, the other ones warrant consideration, and then just let them mess with them.
That's kind of what
Yeah, yeah.
Meaning, okay, so I'm just going to repeat so staff's not totally confused because I am. We're going to move 1, 3, and 4 to the first list and leave 2 and 5 as potential solutions. Is that, everyone comfortable with that?
Yes, that makes more sense to me. That these are the actual recommendations, these are potential solutions.
I see some head shaking.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to jump in on one thing, and it's going back a little bit, but number 2 on page 2, addressing administrative support needs, which is really a good recommendation, I think. One of the things that we talked about when we compared some of the other neighborhood associations and other organizations, other cities, was resources for these area commissions. And so I think it's implicit in this recommendation that the city's going to consider what financial resources would be brought to bear to accomplish some of these things. But I'm wondering if, that implicit suggestion is clear enough and that we might be more explicit about, considering some of the, some additional resources for the city that might include increasing the funding level for each area commission.
Can we maybe just add some language to number 2 that talks about resources, or at least references that?
I mean, none of these things are going to be possible unless there's some additional resources. So, maybe it's fine the way it is, but I think that's critical if you're going to do that, and I hate to not be clear about that.
I think it's a topic that it's fair for us to have a little anger about or a little frustration about. I'm really troubled by how nominal the numbers are that we hand on to these folks doing this really important work. You can't buy drinks for I don't mean alcohol. I mean, you can't buy bottled water for the area commissions with the sort of money that we push down. It's just, I think it's wrong.
We're not actually allowed to buy bottles of water with money.
I say, in any case, you take my point, that this is so nominal, frankly, it's offensive, and it doesn't show respect to the area commissions. I'm a little angry about this, and I think our language being a little pointed, which is where Carrie's going, I think, is right on.
Well, and I think as Carrie just said, all those things would require funding. I mean, if you're going to have web hosting for 18-plus area commissions, there's some substantial cost associated with that. So as you go through this, or even records retention, where do you store all this stuff? There are costs associated with all that. So I think that's a great point. So any staff confusion that we've created on this? Okay, so on this first set of recommendations, I feel like we've fleshed out supporting area commissions and we've given them some direction. I think we've given them less direction, but direction on the size and structure piece, in that the specific recommendations we're not necessarily wanting to change. I think at this time, concept was sort of key to some of the overall discussions, as well as maybe less history and more explanation of the responsiveness, or getting to the heart of why the district or ward issue continues to come up. Does that make sense for staff?
Yes, and I wanted to clarify that the committee also wants an inclusion of more data on competitiveness included in the explanation under form or structure of government.
There's a comment Carrie referenced.
that's just what influenced my thinking. So I don't know that it needs to necessarily be in the introduction. I just think de-emphasizing the election results is sort of, there's, this sentence, committee concurs with the electors that essentially we don't need districts, and then the committee has received no new information to compel it to recommend otherwise. We've received a lot of new information, but it's, but this isn't the most compelling thing. So I don't think we need to get too hung up on it. I just felt like we were predicating all our findings on the outcome of the election, and I think that would do a disservice to the work that was done through the committee
I
process.
think what you're really saying is we don't necessarily need to add the data specifically, but a reference to the fact that we reviewed a lot of data that makes the recommendations consistent or in line with the data that was evaluated. Is that fair? Okay. So, any other comments on these recommendations? So again, the plan will be, staff will provide some edits. I would assume they'll be emailed out before we meet again next Friday. So again, in light of trying to get to a final product, if you do have comments or questions, please send them to staff. Again, not to each other, but at least staff would be prepared to address issues, especially if they're grammar or structure, then we can fix that. Edward, I'm volunteering you. Yes. Okay, so we can take a 5-minute break if anyone wants to, or we can move right in.
What are you moving into?
We are going to move, that is a very good discussion. We are moving into the second set of recommendations, which were related to vacancies, appointments, and employment status.
What happened to additional 2 members on council?
It was in the, it's in the part we just covered.
That didn't get discussed just now.
Okay,
Because
It's highlighted on page.
page
I
2.
don't see words representative, fairness in any of that. So I don't like that recommendation. But as you know,
Yes, it's on the top of page 2.
It's the second
It
paragraph
starts
highlighted.
with, the version looks a little different. Yeah. Let me follow along here. It's the second bolded part, so looking at yours, it's this right here. Well, I guess I would start with, I was assuming, Fred, that you were not supportive of that section.
good assumption.
Yes, John.
My issue is more subtle. I think I was very clear, my interest in this result is clearly conditioned upon certain things happening, not sort of tempered recommendations later on, not styled as conditions. So I'm with, well, unless we declare, I accept the fact that I may have a minority position on this narrow point, all right? For the extra 2 to work for me, it's conditioned upon certain things happening later on here in this report. Right now, these are simply later recommendations, and the fact that at least I would have them be a condition, it gets lost. Now, others may or may not agree with the condition, that's their privilege, but there's my place.
My brain is not connecting. But so in that language that's currently there, we have the committee therefore recommends the consideration of 2 additional at-large council members. However, the committee recommends that this potential change must be accompanied by other specific recommendations that will facilitate more collaborative engagement with the public, including strengthening the city's area commissions. So would you want that language to be different?
Again, we've got a lot of recommendations, there's no place, and again, I think I have a minority view on this. This whole finding of 2 more, my support for that recommendation is conditioned up, not based on recommendations, conditioned upon a result that changes be made with respect to creating greater familiarity and with respect between, that's area commissions, and also there is this notion of geography that people are responsible for. Those are the 2 conditions for my support of this proposition.
When you say conditioned, you mean by then what we go on to explain about area commissions? I don't necessarily think that's as much in the minority as you would think. So really what you're,
That's the
which
key.
goes to that idea of assigning council members,
Yeah, that's,
which we moved to our specific
What if it wasn't, what if it flip-flopped? What if it didn't lead with this portion being first, but that the support of area commissions be first? And then after that, you say, basically, these are the recommendations, you do these things, and then,
I don't have an opinion about the composition. I think you all understand what I'm saying, and I don't think we need to do it here right before our very eyes, if you understand what I mean. If you sort of agree with the notion that, yeah, we don't want 2 more unless we do something differently on those 2 points.
And I think what you're saying is, if council were to review all of our recommendations, you would not want them to say, okay, we're going to go with the 2 more members, the committee recommended it, and do nothing else.
Result.
And I agree with that. I mean, I think the area commission piece is essential. I see a lot of head shakings on that. So I do like the idea of moving the order, potentially, but also maybe we just say that. I'm trying to think of this, our recommendation, the committee therefore recommends. I do like the word conditioned upon action related to area commissions as recommended above or something like that. Jeanette?
Question here to staff. Regardless of how we write this, doesn't council have the ability to pick and choose
Absolutely.
everything? So we can do that, but they can
Yes.
still do exactly what you just said.
well at nights.
I was just saying,
Okay.
I think the idea is that it would, so that.
Oh, I know, but I mean, I just
Yes,
wanted to
they
clear
can absolutely
that
do whatever.
it doesn't, you know,
Yes.
that they can
They
carve
could
out
recommend
anything.
4 seats and put that out there to be voted on,
Yeah,
absolutely.
okay, just
But I
wanted to,
think we're all feeling pretty strongly that the focus on area commissions is critical and an essential part, the geography, yes, our word from that meeting, and is essential to the support of adding members. Okay, did that make sense? And I believe Fred's still opposed.
Yes.
Okay,
Unless you want to put condition upon representative fairness and creation of ward elections. You probably don't want to do that.
I probably don't.
Okay.
Okay. Do we need to flesh this out anymore on this set of recommendations? And just to clarify, when we ultimately take a final vote, we're going to take each individual recommendation and vote that way so that it'll be clear if it was 8-1 or 7-1 or 6-2 or whatever, right? Is that consistent with what I believe we're going to do? Okay. So I say we're taking a 5-minute break, so we'll be back about 4:15-ish. Okay, we'll be back. So our continuing discussions now. So we're going to move on to the recommendations, the draft recommendations related to vacancies and appointments. And I want staff to explain, they added some staff comments after some conversations that I had in part with them last night. So I want them to kind of walk through those, and then we'll move into the specifics. Brian, do you want to address some of those?
Chair Coe and members of the committee, thank you. Based on the conversation, it was yesterday, I think, what we endeavored to do is capture what we felt we heard, but then also based on conversations and direction from you, go back to the data that has been presented to the committee and see what that also told us to help inform the final decision. With regard to the first recommendation, essentially all of this is regarding a public process prior to appointment. We specifically looked at the volunteer caretaker appointment process in the city of Seattle, and then the required process in San Diego. The key points that we just wanted to share were, first of all, because council has to make the appointment, there was a great deal of latitude provided to council in coming up with these policies. We note that because it's not captured in the charters of those cities or in other cities that we've looked at. The second is that there has to be public notice for any meeting, so there would have to be sufficient time in order to complete the process. The third is that the process cannot begin until there is in fact a vacancy under law. So for us, that would be the point at which a person has died, resigned, or otherwise vacated the office. And then lastly, the goal that's been expressed in those two cities is to have a public process to solicit input and comment, but to balance that with the need to fill the vacancy, assuring full representation on that council.
So I I think as we started yesterday's conversation, the top part of this is to recommend a specific charter amendment that would address this idea of a public hearing. So there are 4 points establishing via the administrative code a process for filling the vacancy. So we're not dictating to anyone what that process is, but that council must identify the process. That process has to include at least one public hearing with one or more of the potential appointees prior to any council appointment. We also talked about that they can't have that hearing and fill a vacancy on the same day, so that there's some sort of cooling off period, which would clearly allow for additional comments or those kinds of things. And then, as we talked yesterday, to make sure you can actually give notice and all those things, extending the timeline that requires council to replace someone or appoint someone from 30 to 45 days, so there would be time to have that public hearing and provide the required notice. So again, as we talked about yesterday, I suspect some of the other topics might be more challenging to agree on, but does anyone have any concerns about those 4 specific charter recommendations?
No concern. However, you've done this artfully, pointing out again and again that things to be done in the interim as a matter of council action, and this falls in that same classification. Isn't that true? Yes, we're recommending that the charter be amended, and in the meantime, because that's a long process, that you act legislatively to try to accomplish the spirit of the recommendation.
Yes, so the council could have a public hearing whether or not it's in the charter. The only issue with that is timing. They would have to be very clear with the timing to get it in within the 30 days that they're required currently. But yes, council could, I think, do all of these things without a specific charter amendment, but.
I'm obviously asking for a sentence that makes that suggestion that they try to accomplish through an ordinance, if you will, the spirit of the recommendation in the meantime. Yeah.
You're not opposed to it being a charter
I'm not opposed to
charter
it.
change or a charter
I'm
amendment?
supportive, but it's a
Just
recommendation.
got ya. Okay. Think that makes sense, Jeanette?
Yeah, John, you're saying here, it says recommends the charter be amended. That's the language that you're questioning, correct?
I'm agreeing with that language. There's an omission in that I think we need to take the next step and urge them to adopt an ordinance during the amendment process that causes the spirit of the suggestion to be implemented. It'll take a couple, 3, 4, long time.
I think what you're saying is we might not see a charter amendment approved till November, but they could next week have a vacancy, and we're asking them to have a public hearing regardless of the charter amendment process.
Okay, I was thinking we were not seeking an actual charter amendment, but making a recommendation to the council to implement these.
No, I think John still wants a charter, is okay with the supportive of a charter amendment. I would like to see a charter amendment. I think the timing is going to pose an issue for council without a charter amendment to change that, but they can do what they best they can. So any concerns about 1 through 4 as written? Okay, so we're going to move on. Hopefully that's good. So the next part is really about this caretaker or placeholder kind of process. And again, I asked staff to give us a couple options because I felt like this is, again, probably one of the areas where we struggled the most. And I would like Brian to explain again what each one of these means so we can make sure we're all getting the right language. And then, as I mentioned earlier, wanting to make sure that the facts and the data that we looked at are consistent with what we recommend, I asked them to add some ideas that explain that what we looked at. So Brian, if you could flesh out what I mean, that would be great.
Thank you, Chair Coe and members of the committee. I would begin by saying that the chair is correct. She asked us to provide the background data. This is in no way intended to provide staff comment on the recommendation itself, but simply the data that was presented previously so that the committee can consider that as well. Looking at best practices and data from other municipalities, first of all, did want to point out that there is no city that uses the caretaker appointment as its preferred process for filling a vacancy, and that's in the top 50 cities in the United States. Among cities that use a mayor-council form of government, 94% allow for an appointment regardless of whether or not there's also a special election. So 94% would either allow a pure appointment, which is what we do, or they would allow an appointment and then a special election where that individual is eligible to run in that special election. So only 6% would have a pure special election process where there is no appointment prior to that special. Some of the qualitative data we were asked to present. First of all, it is clear that a caretaker policy would remove the perceived incumbency advantage for anyone who is running for council. We do want to also note that that presumes that incumbency is a positive thing. Which is not necessarily always the case. And then the caretaker policy would mean that an appointee would not face public scrutiny or vetting by an election, and that could potentially limit the responsiveness and the accountability of a caretaker or a placeholder. The last thing that I would note from the data, and this will piggyback on a lot of the conversation around this and the political process. It is clear that academic research has shown that the political process has much more of an impact on the outcome than any incumbency advantage. We've seen this recently here in Franklin County. So while there's clearly an advantage to incumbency, that should not be seen in a silo, I think would be our recommendation. Now on to what we tried to piece together in terms of what we heard the committee talking about and some of the options that are out there. And I'll try to very quickly summarize these. The first would be that council would have a preference for caretaker whenever possible, understanding that based on the totality of the circumstances in any given appointment, that may not be the best thing for the city. So for example, council may have an unfortunate situation where an individual is sworn in and the next day they're deceased. Council may decide at that point that they're not comfortable with a caretaker serving for a full 2 years until there's an election. Alternatively, council may say that it's a month before the November election, and it clearly makes sense that a caretaker would be there. It's also possible that there could be a vacancy after a November election, and council may choose to seat a winner early rather than leaving it vacant or placing in a caretaker. The second would be really sort of a riff on what San Diego does. In a municipal election year, there cannot be an appointee who can run for office. So that would essentially mean that whether it's for the full term or for the unexpired term, a caretaker would be ineligible to run in an election year. The idea there being that the person would have the influence or the power of incumbency, but no responsibility to have served prior to having that incumbency. And then lastly, just a strict policy that says in all instances, council shall appoint a caretaker. So those are the three options that the data and other cities sort of led us to present to the committee for your consideration today.
And I would say, if I followed everyone's thoughts yesterday, this is presented as a recommendation for a policy from council. So again, this is not presented as a charter amendment. It would be what we would recommend that council do. So as written here, we sort of need to pick one of those three. I guess I would argue we'd pick one of those four. We could also pick not to do a recommendation related to a caretaker whatsoever and sort of leave the process as is today. So there's really four options, I guess. Three of these, I think some of us at least went down the path yesterday of wanting to have some type of recommendation to use a caretaker function. So that's why 1 to 3 are what they are, but there is still that option that we say the process is the way it is today, I guess, and leave it up to council in total. So do those three options make sense? Do we need Brian to explain anything else?
This is a huge point for me, and I just had this benefit of this explanation, which isn't written, I don't think, anyplace. Is that right? I find no fault with that, but I think I want to sit and look at it. I want to understand it. This is a big deal for me.
Which part do you mean?
I'm talking about the placeholder question you've offered up just for the first time, I think. 3 notions that I think are worthy of consideration, but I haven't had the benefit of seeing them or thinking about them before this.
I think if we're going to say they're in the recommendations. below the first set of staff comments.
All right, you can press ahead. I'm going to spend a little time on this.
Just so we're all reading the same thing. So the three, well, items 1, 2, and 3 on the first page, right under the first staff comment.
This is what we just got.
Yes.
All right. All right.
So this would, these three things contradict each other. So we would not be able to pick, you know, I want to take all three or I want 2 of the 3. It's really pick one of those 3. Or my point is we could still pick do nothing, or recommend that the process stay the same, or recommend that council evaluate its own process. So we could make no recommendation related to caretaker. But I think the 3 options, if you want to say something about a caretaker function, I believe these 3 options kind of outline all of it. So again, putting it sort of in my simplified words, the first one says to council, we like this caretaker idea. We think you should use that, but we will sort of defer to your expertise and accountability on when's the right time to do that. So we're not necessarily saying every single time, but that they would look at the facts of this particular vacancy and apply that. The second one would be an actual recommendation that, and again, I'm going to hope I get the terms right, in the municipal election years, you could not appoint someone who could run. So those years you would appoint a caretaker. That way they would not run in the same year they were appointed. And that's kind of in the middle ground. And then the third option would be that all appointees would be ineligible to run for that next election, which does become complicated because you may have 3 or 4 open seats. So you're saying they couldn't run for any of those seats in the next election. They would have to sit out an entire election. So I think we're potentially, as we talked yesterday, recommending a policy or guidelines to council as to what they should do. And then we kind of need to decide if we pick 1, 2, or 3, or 4, as I would see it. Yes, Fred.
Before we get into the merits of 1, 2, or 3, I guess I would like to see a different word used than caretaker or placeholder. It implies that this person doesn't have really any authority. They're just kind of a figurehead that does something. The first thing that came into my mind just now is interim appointment, but there may be better words.
I like that word.
Yep.
Point. Yes, Carrie.
I'll just reiterate, my point of view from yesterday, which is, I think there's value in having additional voices come on to council, but, I think that needs to be balanced against making sure that there's enough time for council members to better understand the city and the community and bring that value to bear in their policymaking role. So I'm not hugely supportive of this provision of adding, putting limits on the time one can serve if being appointed. I think there's an election process so the voters can decide, who and when can serve. I don't like to put limits on that. But at the same time, I recognize there is a perception out there, which is why we're here. And I think in a nod to that perception, the political process notwithstanding, as we've talked about, I'd be willing to support number 1 and give council the latitude as recognition that this is something that has been a community concern in certain areas. I do think to reinforce that, I think that especially if it's close to the election or if it's in an election-oriented context. I don't know about the full election year, but I think the council will be wise to think about that more seriously. So I could support number 1, but I do have some reservations about the idea of being very specific and limiting council's capacity to make sure they can appoint their replacements in an effective way. So that's my perspective on the 1 through 3.
Gary?
I'm supportive of number 1. I think giving council the because it provides flexibility for all of the reasons that we talked about before. And it gives you, which I do believe we've somewhat in a way had some sort of number 1 in the past. And I think it has worked. So of the three options, I think that's the option that I would lean towards because of the flexibility.
I do think we've seen it happen, even recently, but this would be a little more concrete,
Yes.
that after hearing from the community and the research, we think there should be something we'd seriously consider. Fred, did you want to add something to that?
Oh, well, I did a sidebar with Kerry, and just to put it on the record, I would kind of, I think, be just the reverse of him. I would be most supportive of number 3, going down to number 2 and then number 1. He's kind of, not to put words in his mouth, but he wants number 1, maybe number 2, maybe number 3. So we need ranked choice voting now, right?
Okay.
Where's Jeff Cabot when we need him?
Jeanette, any thoughts on? John?
Well, Ryan always makes me think, and that makes me so angry.
That's my favorite comment from today.
You offered up a couple examples of where a hard and fast rule might not be the most sensible result. But I think the fix for that is to craft the words that represent the exceptions. This whole notion of letting them decide, that's pretty much what we got now. And I don't think that's why this panel got established. I mean, a vacancy that occurred very early maybe might warrant people deciding we'll just do a regular appointment. Or if it happened very late and you wanted to seat the winner of the next election, I'd like to see those exceptions developed and defined, articulated, and otherwise the rule is then the interim. They appoint an interim. Just this notion of, I'm trying to meet you not halfway, but a third of the way anyway. Because I think you've offered up a couple examples that, yeah, that probably is not the most sensible way of going forward.
I think this is where I struggle, because when you first talk about this caretaker, interim, placeholder, it seems to be the most logical to me. But then when you flesh out what could happen, what that would look like, what's the hypotheticals, it doesn't seem as logical to me. And I think this is another one of those points where, as I was thinking about it, how much specific, concrete direction do we want to give council, and where do we want to be more flexible? And I see the positives and the negatives of both sides, but I come back to, they are the body that's elected and held accountable. If they're making poor choices when it comes to appointments, then as voters, we should be addressing that both with who they appointed and the people who did the appointment. And I feel like number 1, and we could maybe craft the language as more concrete. I don't know if we want to use examples, that may be an option, but in the sense that I think what we're trying to say, listening to the community and addressing the issues, that the caretaker interim model seems to be something that would be better received by the community, and allow people to feel like we weren't just creating this political appointment process, or making this very political. I think practically we all know that we can't change the politics behind all of this. But at least that would be out there, that that's what this committee is recommending. But still, that if they came to the set of facts that they felt that was not the right choice. And I think the example that was just used about someone's been elected, it's after the election, they've won the seat, they just don't take it till January and there's a vacancy. It makes sense to me that you would not put a caretaker in there when someone's about to occupy that seat in 30 or 60 days. So I think, there's some very logical reasons why I can imagine as a council member you could articulate we're not going to use a caretaker function. So I think part of what I'm maybe not as strongly as you, but are saying is that we want to encourage them to use a caretaker interim model as much as possible, recognizing that there's some situations where that might not make sense. And I just struggle with how long will we have to make the list to come up with all the hypotheticals that.
Well, let's see the list, then we'll make a judgment of how long the list is. This is a bigger question. This all competitiveness. Kerry and I have the same consideration, and we're in a place where there's a dominant party. And there's resistance, not just among ours, but among D's a little bit too, that just doesn't feel quite right. And this is one that I think they expect us to get some traction on. And this notion of simply deferring to council, which is a little the way one feels, I don't think it doesn't work for me. So I'd like to see, and Brian came up with 2 great ones. Maybe the next time he shows up, you'll have 10 of them. I don't know. Then maybe I'll come in your direction more. But for the moment, I think we should have narrowly defined circumstances where, in fact, they make an appointment, and otherwise, it's the interim.
So as written, you would, similar to Fred, lean more towards being supportive of 3?
I'm all for 3 unless you can define exceptions for 1 that make me comfortable.
Just trying to understand where everyone's at.
This whole question of competitiveness, again, we go back to Brian's work. This suggests this is a community, we don't quite have competitiveness, but they're a little worried that they might not get reelected. I mean, I think that's sort of the gray area we're in. And so these tiny little adjustments that maybe only occur once in a while and only influence just a little bit, sometimes they count. Okay, that's why this is why it's a big point for me. I think this is really fundamental to moving towards greater competitiveness in very limited circumstances. I'll confess that to you.
I would be supportive of potentially narrowing number 1, to your point, John. I mean, I think what attracted me to number 1 was some of the examples that you gave, right? There are specific situations that call for this is. If we lock ourselves into certain situations, I'm thinking of, what if you're there for a month, or goes back to what you were saying, Carrie, so, I mean, how effective can you be within that month, right? So what happens in that situation, which is why I like the flexibility of 1, but I do think narrowing the scope might be a good exercise.
Okay, so, Jeanette, I wasn't sure if you were still thinking.
You stall as long as you can.
You can stall till next Friday, potentially.
I mean,
Thinking.
I'm still thinking about the entire caretaker process, so.
I thought so.
But, 1, I understand. 1. That's the realities. These things happen. But I'm concerned if we do this, of having too much flexibility, it puts the council, the perception may be that the council is making a decision, maybe manipulating the process. So that's what I'm trying to, I understand totally the flexibility in 1, but using those can put the council in a position that they can be accused of manipulating. So I'm struggling with how do we narrow it down to, if we go with the caretaker, how do we give them the flexibility to make these decisions and still honor a commitment to the public of a structured process? Because we're going from appoint someone in 30 days to, oh, well, we may do it for this period, or we may not do it this period. So we're going from a very finite, cut and dry, to a lot of flexibility, and that's what I'm just thinking through, so.
Brian?
Insight from Seattle that could help with both your comments and Mr. Rosenberger's comments. Seattle, in its most recent process, chose to use a caretaker, and that was established on the front end of the process as council announced that there was a vacancy. So there was a presumption that a decision has been made, it's been articulated, you're not waiting until the vacancy is announced, and oh, by the way, this person is going to be eligible to run. Instead, it's sort of known up front. The other thing I do want to point out, and perhaps we could have done a better job crafting number 1, the idea would be that the presumption is that in all vacancies, you would have an interim appointee, unless the totality of the circumstances show otherwise. So the idea being that you really have, in a way, placed the onus on council to say, this is why we don't think an interim appointment makes sense here, rather than the reverse, which would be the presumption is we will make an appointment, they'll stand for election if they want to, but we may do an interim from time to time. So that was the intent of number 1.
So how about, that clarifies things. Because of the time, How about if you guys spend probably the most time on this section? I think, Brian, if we could flesh out what you even just said, that making it more clear that the presumption, or whatever the right word is that it will be a interim function. I do think we should change the word, although I'm not going to remember to say it. So,
The presumption is that.
the presumption is that you would have an interim. Yes, thank you. And also to define more clearly that it's identified at the beginning of the process, so that people understand that it wouldn't be, let's see who's out there and then decide if they're going to run or not, but that you would set that expectation at the point you announce the process. I think those two would help flesh out number one. And then I think if everyone can just kind of obviously focus on everything, so maybe we can get to a final set of conditions to vote on next Friday. But this will clearly be the section we have to spend more time on. That'll give everyone a chance to kind of think about it. And I think it maybe just so we have things to consider, to John's question or point, are there examples or are there things you could help us put on that sort of list maybe? But I like the way you were just rewording it in the sense that it wouldn't be a matter of deciding this time to use it as an interim function. It would be really more justifying why you wouldn't use an interim process.
Well, there's a process, from where you described it, it was more of a standardized process, and not a, yeah.
Difference between presumption and preferred. There's a big word choice. I think I would want to say, though, that the length of the remaining term is not an extraordinary circumstance that warrants the abandonment of the presumption. Are you with me? All right, I don't care if it happens after he or she's only served 3 months. I think it needs to be an interim. After the election, before they take office, all right, that's a little different deal. Are you with me? And I'm prepared to acknowledge that crap happens, and it's indefinable, unforeseeable, and so our little wiggle room, I'm okay, but it needs to be extraordinary, and length of the term alone is not an extraordinary condition, in my opinion.
So, does that make sense? Yes, Jeanette.
No, I just want before we adjourn. Question.
Okay, so I think for next week, there'll be drafts sent out, so hopefully everyone can read them. Again, comments back to staff only, not each other. But specifically, we'll start with this section and try to see if we can narrow down options 1, 2, or 3 that we'll have some revised language for. And then hopefully, again, we'll then go back to looking at all the revised language of the other sections. And my intention would be that we would kind of sit here with the computer and hopefully come up with a final version. Is everyone okay with that? Yeah, we'll see what we can do. So that'll be the goal, but we'll see how it goes. So anything else? I know you have a question. Anything else anyone has any concerns about, comments? Okay, Jeanette?
Going back to full-time, part-time.
Yes, I don't think we finished that last.
Okay.
I mean, as it's written, there's no charter recommendation. There's a comment, but we can decide if we want to put anything in there or nothing. So yes, we've not concluded that discussion.
So we're getting all of the language before Friday.
Yes, we will have all of the revised language before we meet on Friday. Okay.
Brian, for you, a timeline, because we're talking about elections in the municipal year. In a municipal election year, what's the cutoff date for a candidate to run? If this is a municipal year, someone resign tomorrow, we could still have time to appoint, correct? And they would be on the ballot for November.
Correct. So
What is the time, what are the cutoff dates? Because at certain points, it's too late for the very next election, and that's where I was.
So,
Huh?
so the city of Columbus.
I feel every time I ask you this, I just had a chart because I get confused.
Yeah, well, and it is a little confusing because in a system with nonpartisan elections, it's really an elimination primary. so it's not a party-based primary. That means that there is only a primary if you have one more person than double the number of seats. Does that make sense? So if you're talking about mayor, if you have 3 people file, you've got a primary. You have 2 people file, you don't. Those 2 people would automatically go to the general. The deadline to appear on that primary ballot is 90 days prior, and the threshold is 1,000 valid signatures here in the city of Columbus. Now, I will also say that at any point, if a person who's qualified for the ballot is deceased or otherwise steps down, the party of 5 members on their petition committee can replace them on the ballot. So we have, for example, petitions that are circulating right now for council where there's 1 candidate and 2 placeholders. So the presumption would be at some point after those people have made it to the ballot, they would be substituted with other candidates. It's a pretty standard practice in municipal elections.
So because council is on this 30-day, and I'm trying, let's pick after the primary date, someone resigns in June, and council appoints within 30 days, that person could still have to stand for election in November?
That is correct.
Because because it goes to the special election, and that's the different timing that, when we're looking at this, we're always talking about municipal election, but there's a timing sequence here that I'm trying to work through.
You are correct, and I think the timing that you're looking for, if I remember correctly, and I'll verify this before the next meeting, I believe that it's 45 days before the election would be the cutoff to substitute because of death or disability of a candidate. So that would really sort of be, if you're talking about a municipal election year, 45 days before the general election would be the point at which a council appointee could not then appear on the ballot if they had not otherwise qualified. Fairly late in the year.
But still. Okay. Thank you. I'll draw my own chart.
All right, so we will be back next Friday, 2:30 here. I don't believe there were any speaker slips, is that correct? Okay, so is there a motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
Anyone object? No, I'm kidding. And all those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned, thank you.